Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you for watching. In this video I want to talk about Kant's ethics as we find it discussed in his Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. Hereafter I'll refer to that work as just the groundwork. So let's just dive right in. Immanuel Kant, 18th century German philosopher. He did philosophy in all areas, including metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. This video will focus on his ethics, and in particular, it's going to focus on the groundwork and a couple of the key concepts from the groundwork. We can't cover everything in this video, so I'm going to cover Kant's theory of the good will, and I'm going to cover his theory of the categorical imperative. So let's begin with his concept of the good will. So we're going to see the good will, the categorical imperative are key concepts to his moral philosophy. So the good will is for Kant, on one understanding, a will that is disposed to do the right thing for the right reason. And in order to understand what this means, Kant wants us to understand a series of cases that he provides. Now, I don't want to go through the whole series, so what I'm going to do is present one of his cases. And then what I'm going to do after presenting that case is present a case that I've invented to relate to it, to see what Kant's after when he develops this idea of the good will. So hopefully that will suffice. So here's the first case. Let's call it shopkeeper, because it involves a shopkeeper. And in this case, a shopkeeper has a customer before him, an inexperienced customer. The shopkeeper, if he wanted to, could overcharge, charge an unfair price in order to gain advantage, to make a killing on the deal, if you will. Well, Kant tells us that in this case, the shopkeeper ends up charging fair prices, and the reason why he charges fair prices, Kant stipulates, is based on self-interest. So the shopkeeper recognizes that if he continues charging fair prices, which presumably is a duty that shopkeepers have generally, then he's likely to gain, perhaps continue his having a good reputation as an honest dealer. So we see why, in this way, Kant is stipulating that his reason is based on self-interest. It's based on his self-interest in bringing about continued good business into the future. So that's shopkeeper case. Now Kant wants us to have a judgment elicited in this case, but let's see if we can look at a case that I've invented that's just like shopkeeper. Let's call it shopkeeper star case. So you have shopkeeper star. In that case, everything's the same, except for there'll be a couple of key differences. You have an inexperienced shopper before a shopkeeper. The shopkeeper's in a situation where he needs to decide what to do. Should he charge fair prices, or should he go for a killing in the deal? Well, let's suppose that he charges fair prices, just like his shopkeeper. So he charges fair prices. But now suppose in this case that you see all this go down. You see the shopkeeper could have made a killing on a deal, and you would go up to him and you say, hey, why did you charge fair prices? You could have made a killing on that deal. And then suppose the shopkeeper turned to you and said, what are you talking about? I charge fair prices because it's the right thing to do, to charge fair prices, no matter who the customer is. Okay, so that concludes shopkeeper star. So you see the differences between them. Differences between them involve thinking only about the reason or motivation for acting. So Kant would want us to see in this case that it's the second case that's better than the first. If we have that judgment, then Kant would say that the only thing that explains the difference between the two cases, shopkeeper and shopkeeper star, is the reason or motivation for acting. So it's got to be the case that in the second case, the shopkeeper had a better reason for acting. And in fact, Kant would want to say that it's in that case only, in thinking about these two cases, that the shopkeeper has a moral reason for acting. So Kant would say this: in the first case of shopkeeper, the shopkeeper does the right thing. The shopkeeper does his duty. It's his duty to charge fair prices. But he doesn't do so for the right reason. He does so based on self-interest. He doesn't do so for, as Kant would say, a moral reason. And that's the difference between shopkeeper and shopkeeper star. Shopkeeper star, we see that the shopkeeper does the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And Kant says that in this case then, or Kant would say, in this case, he doesn't discuss this, in the case I invented, in Shopkeeper Star, that the shopkeeper acts for a moral reason. That is to say that his reason for acting just is what his moral obligation is, namely to charge fair prices. So we see here that we think about what the right thing to do is, the morally right thing to do is, according to Kant, it's going to depend on the reason. Kant's going to say that only when the reason for acting is a moral one is the action a moral one. So all other actions, if they're the right action, they're going to count as merely right, but not morally right. So Kant gives us a very important distinction between right action on the one hand and morally right action on the other. You do the right thing when you do your duty, but your reason for doing your duty could involve things like self-interest, and your self-interested reason could just coincide in some cases with doing the right thing. On Kant's view, doing the morally right thing is going to involve doing the right thing, like the shopkeeper Star did, and in that case does the right thing, but then he also does it because it's the right thing to do. So the morality is the thing that's motivating the shopkeeper and Shopkeeper Star to do what he does, so he does that which is morally right. So for an action to be morally right, it must be the case, according to Kant, that the action is performed for a reason that is itself a moral one. Okay, the goodwill, in Kant's view, is a will that is disposed to do the right thing for the right reason. Put another way, the goodwill is a will that acts or that performs morally right actions. Not just right actions, but morally right ones. So this is someone who is disposed to, when he or she acts, to have this right kind of reason guiding the behaviors in question, such that we end up with actions that aren't just right, but morally right. Okay, that hopefully helps us understand what the goodwill is. Now let me just discuss one further case that Kant gives us in the context of thinking about the goodwill. There are a host, and I invite you to read them in Kant's groundwork. He has us think about a sympathetic philanthropist, as I call the individual. A sympathetic philanthropist is someone who is inclined to do good for others. Think about what a philanthropist is. That's someone who loves humankind. And someone who's sympathetic is someone who is moved by sympathy. And Kant's use of the term sympathy in his works is usually understood in more broad terms to understand also empathy or compassion, to act compassionately. So we're supposed to imagine someone who acts compassionately or sympathetically towards others and does good things for people. So if we wanted to supply some content to Kant's case here, it'd be like, imagining someone who is disposed, when they come across people who are in need, to feel sympathy for them and thus to help those who are in need. So if we imagine a case involving a sympathetic philanthropist who sees someone who's hungry and in need, and the sympathetic philanthropist has the means, the sympathetic philanthropist is disposed to help, moved by sympathy. Now you got to keep in mind here that the sympathetic philanthropist is going to get some kind of pleasure, typically from helping others who are in need. But here's the important thing. That pleasure isn't the driving force, according to Kant, for why it is that the sympathetic philanthropist does good for others. Rather, the driving force is the sympathy itself. So we shouldn't understand Kant's sympathetic philanthropist as someone who is acting based on self-interest or for egoistic reasons. So that's the case of a sympathetic philanthropist. So imagine someone who goes out doing good for others and does so for the sake of sympathy. Now, in this case, Kant tells us that the sympathetic philanthropist, though she acts correctly, though she acts rightly, she does her duty, she does not act morally rightly. So let me see if I can explain. Now, Kant thinks, or he's supposing in this case, that we have a general duty to do good for others when we can. He's imagining the sympathetic philanthropist who lives up to this duty. So in that sense, the sympathetic philanthropist does that which is right. But now, Kant wants to say that the sympathetic philanthropist does not act from a good will. It doesn't act morally correctly. And that may seem shocking because it seems as if the sympathetic philanthropist is someone who's acting excellently, and you'd want to say morally, maybe intuitively, but Kant says that the sympathetic philanthropist is not acting morally, not immorally, just amorally. Why? Because the sympathetic philanthropist's reason for acting or motivation for acting is based on, guess what? Sympathy. It's not based on acting, as Kant would say, morally. When you act morally, your reason for acting is a moral one. And according to Kant, even though sympathy is good, it's not morally good. So we should praise and encourage those who are sympathetic philanthropists, but we shouldn't esteem them, as Kant would say. We shouldn't respect them as acting morally in these cases. Now, we should respect all people in some sense, but we shouldn't respect as moral what the sympathetic philanthropist is doing. So hopefully that makes some sense here. So let me see if I can just do some clarifications. Kant is not saying that the sympathetic philanthropist is acting immorally, that is acting in such a way that she's acting in any sense evil or poorly or any such thing. Kant would say that she's doing the right thing, so she's not acting immorally. Okay, but she's acting amorally, meaning there's no moral value that's there. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind here. The next thing to keep in mind is why it is that Kant would say this. Well, part of it involves thinking about how Kant imagines or envisions, thinking about the emotions. Sympathy is a kind of emotion that we have. And Kant doesn't think that we have control, at least direct control, over our emotions. And so it just kind of turns out that the sympathy had by the sympathetic philanthropist, it leads to performing the right action. It's a kind of coincidence, if you will, that happens in that way. Sympathy can in other circumstances lead to doing the wrong thing. But the key thing here is that the sympathy is not something that the sympathetic philanthropist has control over, so we wouldn't want to say that there's any morality there. Why? Because on Kant's view, if you do something moral, then you had control over what you did. And sympathy is not the kind of thing that the sympathetic philanthropist had control over. She just responds with sympathy, right? That's just part of the way she's made up, and then she performs her actions. So on Kant's view, right thing, but not the morally right thing, because the action kind of comes from something within the agent that the agent has no control over, namely his or her feelings. Maybe the sympathetic philanthropist gets sympathy from the natural lottery, maybe from her parents, something like that. Okay, so that's a way of thinking about why it is that Kant, or at least part of the reason why Kant thinks that the sympathetic philanthropist does not act morally, even though she acts correctly or rightly in doing her duty. Okay, so we've got through a couple of key cases, including one that I invented in order to understand the concept of the goodwill. I need to move on and say some things about the categorical imperative. And so what I'm going to do is just wrap up this discussion of the goodwill and then move on to the discussion of the categorical imperative in part 2 of my video series on Kant's ethics. Okay, so keep in mind that to have a goodwill is to be disposed to perform morally correct actions. You perform morally correct actions, remember, when you do the right thing, you do it for a morally right reason. You do it for the sake of morality, as Kant would say. Another way in which Kant might put this is to say that you perform the action, the correct action, out of respect for morality. So you want to act moral, so it's not going to be the case that you don't want to act moral, although it might be part of your motivational structure not to want to, but that's offset by the fact that a part of you also wants to act moral. And then out of respect for morality, out of respect for the moral law, sometimes Kant puts it, you end up acting correctly and also morally correctly. So you see, Kant's view of the goodwill gives us good reason for thinking that he's not consequentialist in his thinking about morality. That is to say, Kant does not think that the moral action is determined by bringing about good consequences, as some moral philosophers do, but rather the moral action is based on having the right kind of reason for acting. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for now, and then I'm going to move on to the goodwill next. Thank you for watching.